To check out all our products, go to musicnomadcare.com.
Bridge radius is the arc of the strings at the bridge, and that arc should match the arc of the frets. The frets have a radius, the bridge will match that radius. To do that, I'm going to use my radius gauge. When I had the strings off the guitar, I measured the fretboard radius at a 14-inch radius. So I'm going to set my bridge radius to match that. In order to change the radius of your strings, you have to insert shims underneath the saddles to make the correct arc. So I'm going to go ahead and measure and see where I am now, and then I'll determine what I need to do to make that arc a correct 14-inch. Whenever I'm checking the bridge radius, I like to hold the guitar up vertically, and I can look down the strings at the gauge, and I can usually see what strings are touching and what are not. If you're having trouble seeing that, one trick is to lightly push the gauge up and down on the strings, and then you can see which strings are moving and which are not. Another easy way to determine if the strings are touching the gauge is to set it on the strings very lightly and pluck each string. So by doing that, I can hear that my A string is not touching the gauge, my G is not touching. So I have two strings that are too low. To adjust the height of the saddles, I will be installing small metal shims underneath the low saddles. These are just a typical locking tremolo saddle adjustment shim. You can find them online at a variety of Luthier supply outlets, so they're pretty easy to get a hold of. Now, one thing that you need to remember as you're setting the radius on a double locking tremolo like this, you'll be using a standard locking tremolo saddle shim. You may not be able to get your radius exactly perfect. You may be 1/1000th or 2 high or low just because of the thickness of the shim, but you can get it usually very, very close. But if you have one string that's just a tiny, tiny bit low, you're just going to have to live with it because the shim might take it to a point where it's too high. But it's well within tolerance. You'd never notice it while you're playing. Whenever you measure your radius on a double locking tremolo like this, in order to determine the proper number of shims that you'll need under the saddles, if your bridge radius is wildly out, you have some, 2 strings are touching the gauge, 3 are really, really low, one's kind of in the middle. One thing that you can do to make it a little bit easier to determine the number of shims you need, you can set the gauge on top of the strings, and you can take a shim and you can just look and see, is it going to fill the gap between the string and the gauge? And then you can guess, well, do I need 1 shim? Do I need 3 shims? And you may have to try a couple of times. Even as long as I've been doing this, sometimes it'll take me 2 or 3 tries on a saddle to get it exactly where I want it. So you can start with 1 if it doesn't look very low, or start with 2 if it looks kind of low, but you may have to give it a couple of rounds to actually dial it into where you want it. The easiest way to install a shim under the saddle is to first loosen the string. So I'll loosen that until I have a good amount of flop in the string. And then I will go ahead and tighten down the nut lock using my Guitar Tech screwdriver with a 3mm Allen head on it. So I'll pull the string slack and I'll snug down my nut lock. Now that just holds the string loose and keeps it from pulling back towards the headstock. The next thing that I will need to do is remove the saddle from the bridge. I will now use a 2.5mm Allen wrench to loosen the saddle itself. So I will loosen this little screw in the front of the saddle, and I'll have to take that screw all the way out. Now this screw happens to have a washer, so you want to be careful and hang on to that. Now I will take my shim, lift the saddle up, and I'll slide my shim underneath the saddle like so. Now I'm going to assume that my intonation was somewhat close. There are several holes underneath the saddle. There's 3. There's one close to the front of the bridge, one in the middle, and one farther back. That allows you a wider range of saddle adjustment. I'm going to put the screw back in the hole that it was in, and if I need to move it forward or back, I can do that later. So what you do is you take your screw and you make sure that it's in the hole in the shim, and then you just put it back in the Screw it back down tight on the saddle. Snug it down. You don't want to go too crazy tight on these. I mean, you want them to be snug, but you don't want to strip them. They're not a very big screw. So once you put your shim under the saddle, you've tightened it back down, go ahead and get your 3mm, loosen your nut lock again, string back up to pitch. And recheck your radius. That is perfect on the gauge. Okay, so I've got my A string perfectly up to the gauge, and now that's my E, A, and D are all buzzing on the gauge. My G is not. It's actually really low, so I'm probably going to use 2 shims on this one. So I'll do the same thing that I did on the A string. I'm going to tune down my G. I'm going to take my 3mm Allen wrench, tighten up my nut lock. Now I'll go ahead and remove the saddle screw fully. So I'm going to take 2 shims and go ahead and put those right under this saddle. You can lift it up using the string, and these will pop out completely from the tremolo unit. If yours does fall out, don't worry. All you have to do is just slide it back in under the fine tuner, and it'll go right back to where it was. There's not really any way that it can fall apart or have any problem. So now I've got my 2 shims, and you again just want to make sure that your screw is going through the holes in the shims. So once you have them through the holes, you can kind of slide the shims into place. Tighten down your saddle. Try to get it back close to where it was. We'll be setting intonation at the last step anyway, so we'll move it around, but want to make sure it doesn't get too far away. And we'll loosen our nut lock. Tune back to pitch. There we go. And once again, measure our bridge radius. Well, that couldn't really be any better. I mean, that's about as perfect a radius as you're going to get. Sometimes you will, install your shims and maybe it rocks a little bit on the string if the shim's a little too thick, or it's maybe got a tiny gap if the shim's a little too small, but this is exactly right on the money. So you can get them very, very close.
For more videos on how to perform guitar setups or care for your frets, subscribe to our channel and visit musicnomadcare.com for all our products and how-to videos.